The other day, I was out walking on a very chilly Canberra morning with my little mini schnauzer, Vincent. We call it the walk of the 100 Wees. You have to be very patient with Vincent. And the other day, I was waiting, and caught the end of a radio interview in my earpods, where I heard an athlete, many athletes talking at the moment, saying to the interviewer she'd just played a competitive sport game with her husband and she'd lost. She was angry about it, but then she said, and like all women, I really hold a grudge. And the interviewer laughed, and she laughed, and I laughed, and I'm looking down at Vincent, and suddenly I thought, that is pathetic. Not that piddling we. It is pathetic that we are all laughing at the fact that we know women hold grudges. Implicit in that laughter is something else, is a deeper knowledge about women's anger. A shared anger. When I was 16, I was walking down a street in Mexico. I was a newly arrived exchange student, very excited to express my independence and freedom, and I'd left the university, walked out the gates that I was supposed to be in. It was lunchtime, and I thought I'd go and explore the area and find a taco stand for lunch. So here I was, on my own, walking down the street, and a fellow walking towards me suddenly stood in front of my path, thrust out his bony arm between my legs, grabbed my crutch and squeezed really hard. I buckled over like I'd been winded. I said nothing, I froze, and then he did it again and he squeezed harder and it really hurt. And then he stopped and he stood up, got out of my way and walked on. And that was that. Now, I had no language to explain what had just happened to me, but I can tell you I was really angry at myself. What was I thinking? Walking out on the street at lunchtime on my own. I'm a girl. I had skinny jeans on. I'm a girl. What was I thinking? I didn't ask someone to come with me just in case. I'm a girl. I can't tell anyone. They'll think I'm disgusting. I'm a girl. I felt deeply embarrassed and ashamed. Now, I share that story with you, and in fact, it's the first time I've told that story in public, but I share it with you not because I was deeply scarred by it, because frankly I wasn't, but I share it with you because I realised years later that at the young age of 16 was the first example of what would become hundreds of times in my life that I would have to police myself simply because I'm female and restrict myself simply because I'm female. And I share it with you because I know there is not a woman in this auditorium that hasn't at some stage felt that same vulnerability where we have to police ourselves simply because we are female and remind ourselves of that. Earlier this year, I was very lucky to be sitting in the audience on the eve of Australia Day, listening to our brand new Australia Day recipient, Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, make her speech. And as she was pouring out her story about being 15 years old, a schoolgirl who was repeatedly raped by her teacher, and how she then went on to become a survivor, I found myself wanting to stand up and call out, Grace, don't do it, don't do it. Don't go there, they will rip you apart. The media will absolutely smash you. Don't talk about it. Just at that moment, she was getting to the end of her explosive speech and she said, and I remember him saying, don't tell anyone, don't make a sound. And then she finished with a bellow, well, hear me now. I was gobsmacked. Boy, did we hear her. What happened next wasn't at all what I had expected. There was thunderous applause as everyone stood to their feet, and you could have, the roof could have lifted off. It was so strong. We certainly heard her. We heard her because people are finally listening. You see, I think Australia has reached a moment of cultural reckoning. And God knows, this has been a long time coming. It is a time when we're hearing and sharing stories of women's anger that is rich with opportunity, with hope and possibility if we get this moment right. We're not alone. We're not alone. This is why I really believe it is a moment of cultural reckoning. Right around the world, right now, women's voices are raising everywhere. We saw it with the Me Too movement that swept the globe. We saw it just recently in the UK with the tragic murder of Sarah Everard and the response to that. We're hearing it in the young women's voices around the world. Greta Thunberg with climate change, Malala Yousafzai arguing and protesting for the right for girls to have an education. We're hearing it in the voices of young congresswomen, AOC and the Squad, who are speaking out in Congress, calling out violent and misogynistic language. We're hearing it right across Latin America at the moment. In the Ni Una Menos, Not One Woman More movement that is arguing, protesting against violence against women. We're seeing it in those formidable mothers in Argentina, Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, protesting for human rights. We're seeing it in the Yazidi women right now, the Yazidi militia, taking up arms, putting their own lives on the line to fight back against sexual slavery. We're seeing it in Afghanistan. All around the world at the moment, women's voices are rising. And this is a collective thing. It is a collective movement. The pendulum has swung. You know, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said on International Women's Day last year that the 21st century has to be the century of gender equality. Well, I say the 21st century already is the century of women. Women's voices that have been silent, been absent, been scrubbed out or rendered invisible for way too long finally are being heard. Voices lost to history have been found. And you know what? We need to listen to them. Listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts and with our head. We need to hear them. Here in Australia, stories are coming out just about every day in the media, to the point where I know for many of us it makes us very uncomfortable. We're tired of hearing about it. But stories of sexual violence, stories of gender-based violence, of sexual harassment, stories of women being demeaned, dismissed, called out, she will go, she will go. Stories of women feeling constantly demeaned, dismissed, relegated to being less important, of less worth, less value, less income, less pay, less worthy, and with less merit. And goodness me, don't we all know that those boys in Parliament House, well, they've licked the merit game. Women's status as less is just not sustainable. Female subjugation has reached its nadir. Those voices lost to history are being found, and there is enormous positive power in this moment if we get it right. But women pay a high price for speaking out. What's wonderful though, and what this moment has done for us, is that young women in particular aren't prepared to pay the price of staying silent. Young women who are articulate, are smart, independent, are stepping up and speaking out and giving enormous strength and courage to others. We've seen it in Brittany Higgins stepping up earlier this year when she went on the media to talk about her allegation of being raped in a minister's office by a colleague in Parliament House in Canberra's capital. Women like Saxon Mullins, that brave young woman who for years has fought to change consent laws in Australia after her own convicted rapist was released from jail and a judge then found that he wouldn't be put before another appeal trial because it would be too distressing for him. Younger women, such as Chantelle Contos, who put out a call to school friends to share their stories about sexual harassment. What she got was not just dozens or hundreds, but at last count over 6,000 young Australian schoolgirls sending in their testimonials of sexual violence, harassment and abuse from boys at private boys' schools. These young women who aren't prepared to pay the price of silence are helping swing that pendulum. Young women, of course, have the echo of history in their voice. Way before the suffragettes, when women have been trying to have their voice heard but not listened to. Young women are finally finding the energy that has been building for millennia and using their voice, and it is a beautiful thing to see. But we all need to know, all women need to know, that we are not alone in the anger that we feel stirring within us. In fact, that wonderful woman, Audre Lorde, said there is great information to be found in our anger. And one of my favourite journalists, Christina Lamb, says anger is really an expression of hope. To be angry is to hope for something better. The Secretary-General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, said on International Women's Day last year something quite extraordinary that I'd never heard said from a leader of the UN before. He said, misogyny is everywhere, and gender inequality is simply about power and the abuse of power. And then he said, power is not given. Sometimes it needs to be taken. It needs to be taken. A message for all women. On the 15th of March this year, the day of the March for Justice, I spent the morning in Parliament House here in Canberra, in our capital, doing the rounds of the media, the press gallery, doing various interviews as I was to be a speaker at the Canberra rally. And just about every interviewer asked me the same question. Oh, Virginia, how many people are going to turn up at this rally? Are there really going to be hundreds or possibly 1,000 or two? And I found myself feeling quite anxious about this because the day before I'd been meeting with the organisers of the rally and trying to dampen down their expectations and let them know that, look, it's hard to get women to turn out on a weekday at a rally in Canberra. We might have a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so if we're lucky. And they were saying to me, oh, Virginia, we're hoping to get more than that. We're hoping 2,000 or 3,000. So here I was saying to the media, well, look, we'll wait and see. There are a number of similar rallies, March for Justice rallies being held at the same time right around the country. And in fact, ultimately, there were over 40 locations that held rallies. On that morning, when I walked out of Parliament House, to head towards where I knew the stage would be set up, I took another phone call. It was another media interview, and the interviewer said to me again, Virginia, how many people will turn up? And then was interrupted by a cabinet minister who was also on the call, who said, no one really knows what this march is about. No one really understands what the message is. And suddenly I stopped and said, Minister, if you don't understand what has made the women of Australia so angry right now, then perhaps you're not listening. And to not listen is a choice. At that moment, I walked over the rise and I looked down to where the stage was set. And there weren't 100 or few people. There weren't even 1,000 or 2 or 3. There were 15,000 men and women had gathered to say enough is enough. And to the women of Australia, you are not alone in your anger and you are not alone in your frustration. And at that very moment, There were thousands gathering at the other 40 locations around Australia. By 12 o'clock, we were over 100,000 people who'd come together to say enough is enough. So what do we do with all this anger? We don't need another march. We now know, thankfully, that we're not alone, that men and women around Australia want an end to gender inequality. So what do? We need to deepen our conversations. We need to have those uncomfortable conversations, and we need to take those conversations home. I want all those here who happen to be male or identify as male to step into the shoes of the women in your lives and for a moment look out from where they stand and see what the world looks like and how different it might be from yours. Ask women to share their stories. Ask women to share their views, their concerns. Listen with head and heart to what they say and learn. There are many of us here who might occasionally have the privilege to be sitting at a power table. Our job is to shuffle over and make room for other women who wouldn't normally have a seat there, or better still, get up and give them our chair. Our job collectively is to ask one another, how do we want our future to look? Now, the World Economic Forum has already told us that it will take 135 years to close the gender gap around the world, over 200 years to close the economic gender gap. I don't know about you, but I don't have 135 years. I don't have 30 years. I actually don't have another 5 years to wait to see change and gender equality in our country and around the world. And you know, they say that you can understand a nation's values if you look at how it treats its women. Right now, Australia has fallen right down the global rankings and we sit at number 50 in the world for gender inequality. Well, that's not good enough. We can do so much better. A couple of years ago, when I sat with my beautiful dear mum as she was slipping away from us, and I held her hand, and she was at that point where the death rattle was rattling through her little body. And I remembered one of her famous phrases to me many years before, when I'd been writing about feminism and the choices women are forced to make between career and children and childlessness. And Mum had said to me, "Oh, Virginia, darling, perhaps it'd be best if you don't make a fuss." And I took Mum's hand as I knew she was slipping, and I said, "Mum, I'm sorry, but I will continue to make a fuss because we're not finished yet." And I looked up at her, and I think just for a moment I saw her smile. Thank you.